So I mentioned in a much older video that I wanted to at some point make a video of my problems with ground news, while also noting like 90% of the people I watch, 90% of their slots rather, are sponsored by them, so that might be burning some bridges. I'm still thinking like if there might be cases where I could take that. Someone recently put out a video covering some stuff where I'm like, I probably would not even take that if they offered it to me, and I'm not even getting bad sponsorship offers at this point, but I still might make a video because this is sort of a pattern I'm seeing with sponsorships, and I have some thoughts on that future video. But I was like, okay, well, this video, and I'll link that up in the description, it's not the same criticism I had. My two main criticisms, one of them is that news is noise, and it makes you feel informed when it's not, and I might have a video on that in more detail. But the other one is that the left-right division is not actually useful for having diverse perspectives. And you might think, oh, because I'm a libertarian, well, it's because libertarians just grouped into like center-right. But no, it's actually more complicated than that. And I had a whole video and I was going to make a whole set of charts. I only drew one of them, which is this one. And then I quickly drew another one today. But this one you can see, so horseshoe theory, so you have the this is fine dog at the top, black pill doomer at the bottom, the Democrats, the Republicans, the dinos and rhinos, and then the mainstream establishment, counter-establishment, and then I have libertarians, fascists, and then I'm willing to draw swastikas for educational content. I just thought it was funny to draw it as demonetized for Nazis. And then social democracy, democratic socialism, or socialism even, and communism for the left. And so the this is fine versus this not fine tends to be establishment versus anti-establishment. And I have these other notes. So I drew Steven Pinker and Francis Fukuyama just outside the Overton window on the anti-establishment thing, because it is fascinating to me that these two people are huge cheerleaders for the establishment being mostly fine, just you need some minor reform, while being kind of pretty centrist, like in American political context. And the establishment hates them so much, and it's fascinating. And then down here I have Lasch and Burnham, which I realized after I made this, Burnham later became much more right-wing. When I read his book, The Machiavellians, he was much more centrist. So I would probably, if I was doing this today, I'd have Lasch, Taleb, and Scott as more sort of neither left nor right anti-establishment. And Lasch, Taleb, and Scott are all kind of unintelligible to the establishment because they're so anti-establishment while not being any of these like far right or far left ideologies that they don't know what to do with them. But anyways, so I drew this at the time that I was going to have this criticism. I was going to say, okay, well, the most important axis in politics, I would say, is everything fine versus is it not? The second most important is how well does social engineering work? Anything from does utopian social engineering, like with fascism and socialism, work, all the way down to social engineering doesn't work at all, which is my position. And then you have the mainstream piecemeal social engineering works, utopian social engineering doesn't, that Karl Popper articulated in his book, Open Society and Its Enemies, which is sort of the mainstream establishment. And then I was actually going to say that the third most important distinction was basically the one between you can't do anything, on one hand, like the black pill doomer, to the you need to overthrow the elites to do anything, which is the position of Nima Parvini, with myself in the middle of that one of you can do things, but only by building new institutions. You can't take over the old ones and make them better for systemic reasons. But I realized I think left and right is more important than that one, and I drew this as economic versus social, and also economic counter-engineering, I guess, for the right. But not for the reasons that people think of explicit political views, but rather because of the worldviews that it represents. But I still think it is less important unless you're in the elites and you think everything is fine than these other two axes of is it fine, is it not, and how well does social engineering work. And you will see the people who believe in utopian social engineering, like the fascist and fascist-adjacent people and the communists, they will often read each other's works, and libertarians will often read the works of both. And we're all aware that there is this whole axis of utopian to no social engineering, which is why a lot of these groups hate libertarians so much, is because they recognize we're at the opposite end. But you can still sort of, there's some mutual understanding and respect of just knowing that this distinction exists, that the establishment doesn't. They assume social engineering works, but only at a certain level. And so we need to prioritize which pieces we're doing. And that is sort of their attitude. However, I have realized that I think left and right actually is a somewhat valid distinction for reasons of worldview difference. And the reason that it doesn't stand out to me is because my own views sort of cut across it. And so I've talked about Thomas Sowell, The Conflict of Visions, and then also reading his book, Vision of the Anointed. And I realized I have always believed in what he calls the constrained vision, but I've tried to fit myself in with the left, which believes in the unconstrained vision. But the reason I've tried to do that is because there's like a package of things that liberals and conservatives tend to believe in terms of worldview. And I have the constrained vision, but I also, so I've talked about this book before, started reading it, want to finish it, but I've been introduced to it in the central concept that I want to talk about in these two books, Populist Delusion and Machiavellians, where he talks about the idea of foxes and lions. And so the lions, they have what he calls an instinct for preservation, and they tend to rely on brute force to get things done, while the foxes have what he calls an instinct for combinations, and they like sort of clever solutions and tend to not like the use of force. And so I am obviously a very foxy person. And then on top of that, you have open society and its enemies. So I am a big believer in the value of the open society. And in fact, a post that I wrote for my older blog that I don't share, that I didn't post anyways, but at the time that I read this book, I concluded that basically Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek each got half the puzzle. And I think that's actually wrong. I think Hayek understood the whole puzzle better than Popper, but it is their errors in the left and right as they interpreted it each sort of got half the puzzle. So the issue with the errors of Hayek is that they don't understand that people having agency and the legitimacy of government is important, and they just think what matters is winning. And the errors of Popper think that the process and the legitimacy of process and having the forms of democracy, even if it doesn't impact it, it's the forms of the process that is most important. And I think both of those are wrong and get only half of the take, but I do believe in the open society. And so I'm a strong believer in the open society. I am a fox rather than a lion, but I also am a strong believer in the constrained vision. And so that has put me, as you can see, at least there's probably more traits like this, but I think in general, like in terms of my lifestyle preferences and aesthetics, I've aligned more with conservatives, but in terms of what I've understood my values as, I've aligned more with the left historically. And so tried to fit myself there without really realizing that these people who were preaching the unconstrained vision actually believed and operated off it. And that was, I think, a big part of the final straw in terms of how I finally left the left without joining the right, is because I just realized, okay, they're equally wrong for reasons that are different but also kind of related. And so I think it is the case that you have these two packages of worldviews and approaches that tend to go together enough that people tend to align with one or the other, and it matters on that basis, although that's not the basis that Ground News uses for it. So I think there's some value in it. And then the other thing is, so in this here, you can see I drew a line through the elephant, and that is because that is the line between the establishment and the counter-establishment, which Nick Pardini, Analyzing Finance with Nick, has talked about, and Samuel Francis independently developed in this book. And basically what he talks about is the anti-establishment left was co-opted into the managerial establishment because the values they were preaching were basically more extreme values of what the managerial establishment professed, and so they were useful sort of aspirationally, while the counter-establishment held on to a mixture of bourgeois and prescriptivists, which is like hardcore, old social conservative stereotype. And then also there's another term, another group that was post-bourgeois, I think it is, and united them together, basically being united only by their opposition to the managerial establishment that had taken over in what Burnham called the managerial revolution. And the thing is, the counter-establishment is smaller socially and more homogeneous, more apparently anti-establishment, but the electoral coalition sort of combines the right wing of the establishment with the counter-establishment. And so that means the counter-establishment tends to win more political victories because they have more leverage compared to the anti-establishment left, at least until the establishment wants it to win those victories, and then they win them. But it also means that they are in their own bubble that is kind of separated from the bubble here, but the people in this bubble are more in a bubble than the people in this one. And it's fascinating because I've noticed when I buy anti-establishment left books on Amazon, I will get all sorts of political recommendations, many of which are not explicitly political. If I buy like 2 anti-establishment right books, my recommendations are full of books by like Republican congressmen about this is how the left is ruining America. So there is more homogeneity in terms of it's like more smaller, but it's also the values within it are more diverse. And so there's 2 issues here. So the part that Ground News could pretty easily fix is just determining are they establishment or counter-establishment, because that line, I think, runs a little bit to the right of Fox News, essentially, at least in terms of how we define the spectrum. But then the where are they coming from? Are they bourgeois? Are they post-bourgeois? Or are they prescriptivist? Those are sort of three separate attitudes that it can't cover, although I don't think that is as big of an issue as just that, again, I still think if you are not in the establishment, like thinking everything is fine, then is this fine axis and the how much the social engineering axis should matter to you more than the left-right axis. But anyways, so I wanted to talk about that because I'm like, okay, someone else made a video that sort of made me say, yeah, I'm probably never going to take Ground News as a sponsor anyways, so I don't need to make that video. I might still make one about sponsors, and I might still make one about the why news is noise thing as well. But I still wanted to talk about this idea that I've been meaning to do, and I had a bunch of charts that I wanted to draw, but this was the only one I could figure out how to actually sort of represent in a way that I liked. So I want to talk about that quickly. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and we'll see y'all in the next one.